pals, I'm here today to talk about the books I read for Aussie April. So I actually read 6 books for Aussie April, but I'm only going to talk about 4 books here, which is handy because I'll probably run on about them. So firstly, I've already spoken about this one in a previous video, and that is City of Lies by Sam Hawke. This is the first book in an epic fantasy, I think duology, by the author, and I've heard good things about this, ordered it, and then it arrived in the first week of April and I realised that Sam Hawke was an Australian author. So I think this is the first fantasy book I've read by an Australian author, which is quite exciting, and I will be reading the next one in the duology. And also do feel free to let me know any other Australian authors that you would recommend who specifically write fantasy. So I'm not going to talk about that one here, but I'll link the video where I did speak about that and some other fantasy novels above. And then another one I'm not going to talk about here, but I will be talking about in a couple of days in a different wrap-up video, is the essay collection Growing Up Disabled in Australia, which is edited by Carly Findlay. Really enjoyed this one, but I'm going to be talking about that in my Disability Readathon wrap-up, like I said, in a couple of days. So in this video I have 4 Aussie novels to talk about, and the first one is Evie Wyld's debut novel, and that is After the Fire, A Still Small Voice. I've read her books in a really random order, and this is the last book of hers I had to read because she's released 3 novels and 1 graphic memoir, and I would say that I enjoyed this the same, like on a par with her second novel, which is All the Birds Singing. And I gave them both 3.5 stars, whereas I gave her graphic memoir 4 stars and her newest novel, The Batter Rock, 5 stars. So this book for a debut is phenomenally well written, it's incredibly beautiful, but if you like books with plot, then this is probably not for you, okay? This is an excellent exploration of a place, so it's beautiful if you want to like sit in this really hot landscape and get really excellent descriptions of like really poverty-stricken rural towns and really remote ways of living. And also part of this novel takes place in Vietnam during the war, so you get the descriptions of the landscape there. So the depiction of place is excellent, like second to none, and the character studies in this novel are also excellent, but like I said, there's not a ton of plot. So this follows 2 timelines. One I would guess is close to present day. We follow a man called Frank who has just left the woman he supposedly loves because he has started to be violent towards her, and he's decided that to sort of save them both, he's going to leave her, and he flees to a beach shack that his grandparents owned in a place called Mulberry, I think. I don't know if that's a real place. And when he's there, he starts to engage with the locals and sort of build a relationship with the people around him, and that's his story. And then we also follow the story of a young boy, I think it opens when he's around 11 or 12, called Leon. His parents run a bakery and his father goes off to fight in the Korean War. And when he comes back is a very different man, and then we follow Leon as he grows up and is sent to fight in the Vietnam War. And both storylines are incredibly depressing. Both are filled with violence, just pretty horrific events, particularly the sections that take place in Vietnam. I think she writes those sections brilliantly. I am one of those people who will say I don't like war novels, and what I mean by that is I don't like novels that are set around the war themselves, so on the front lines with the conflict, because I just find it horrific to read. And also if it's really focused on tactics, you know, sometimes I find that just difficult to follow, but I think she really captured the psychology behind what it would have been like to be, you know, fighting on the front lines in a war like the Vietnam War. So I think she did that really well. But yeah, this is really depressing, very violent. Both of these men live really bleak and hopeless lives, and there's a lot of sort of addiction, like alcoholism, and a lot of poverty. So I think this is super strong in terms of character study. I think it's super strong in terms of writing style, but in terms of plot, this was like edging like a solid 4 star into the last 50 pages, and I just felt like I thought the 2 storylines were going to converge a bit more, or I thought there'd be a better sort of, you know, grand finale, and it sort of petered off a bit. And I think it felt a little bit like she could have written a really amazing short story collection with certain segments of this novel, but like as a novel it didn't work completely successfully for me. So yeah, I'd still recommend it, but I will say just don't read the blurb, because at least the blurb in this edition makes it sound like it's going to be somewhat of a mystery novel, and that mystery only comes in the last 50 pages, so it's sort of a spoiler reading it on the blurb, and also it makes you think you're going to be reading a different novel, so don't bother reading the blurb. The next one I'm going to talk about is a beautiful mini hardback. I really wish more books were published like this, and that is The Choke by Sofie Laguna. So I've heard a few Australian booktubers rave about Sofie Laguna's books. I think she predominantly focuses on coming of age stories, which is something I adore. If you've been around the channel for any length of time, you will know I love coming of age stories, particularly when they're focused on girls, and that is what this is. This is a pretty bleak one, okay? So one thing I'll say about the novels I read for Aussie April is they were all pretty depressing, and other than the fantasy. And I realise, you know, I do read fairly depressing fiction in general, but I felt a bit guilty for focusing on really bleak books about one country. So again, feel free to recommend me some books by Australian authors that aren't really depressing, like this one. So this is set in the 1970s, and we follow a young girl called Justine. Yeah, I remember, so I'm really bad at remembering characters' names. Justine is raised by her grandfather, who she calls Pop, and they live in a rural area in extreme poverty. So she grows up, I think, sort of in a trailer, and her grandfather owns some land, and they live off a lot of the land and the sort of animals he has on the land. And she has two half brothers because they share the same father, and her father is involved in like criminal activity, and he only comes and visits every now and again, and he's quite a violent man, he drinks a lot, and yeah, she doesn't really see him. He doesn't take any responsibility for the life of his children. And the first half of the novel is really focused on the desperation her two brothers in particular have in regards to getting their father's respect and adoration, and how Justine feels that as well to a certain degree. But what I really loved about the first half of the novel is it really focuses on her time at school. And one thing I struggle with quite often in coming of age stories is when you're following the life of a child, and yet their hours they spend at school are never mentioned. Like, it will be like referenced that they've been to school, but you'll never see them at school, you'll never get any of those scenes. And as a child, you know, who goes to full-time school like Justine does, that's a massive part of childhood, and to, you know, ignore that element I think doesn't necessarily make sense. So I really like that we spend a lot of time in the classroom. Justine sits beside a young boy called Michael, who she develops a wonderful friendship with. And you're never told explicitly, but Michael, I think, has cerebral palsy. And I think Sofie Laguna wrote that really well. I don't know if she knows anybody in her life with cerebral palsy, but I felt like it was handled really well. She never patronised him as a character. It was acknowledged that Justine recognised that he was treated exactly the same by all of his family. Nobody, you know, would rush around to open doors for him because he was completely able to do that himself, and because of that, that's the relationship Justine builds with him. And she probably gets more out of his friendship than he gets out of his friendship with her. And those sections just I found wonderful. There was a sleepover scene in particular that just, I felt like crying the whole way through reading it. It was so beautiful. The second half of the novel really shifts, and it jumps forward a few years to when Justine's around 15 or 16, and it becomes a lot more depressing, okay? So this book features sexual assault, like I said, lots of poverty and neglect. Justine is not supported in terms of her education, and because of that, in the second section, when she's a bit older, she doesn't understand things that she should understand at that age, because she just doesn't have a support system in place, and it's very hard to read. There are scenes where I had to read them with gritted teeth, being aware as an adult reader who understood what was happening. I could just see where the scene was going, and I knew Justine couldn't, and it was horrible. I found the ending maybe bordering on saccharine. Like, I'm glad it went that way, and I was relieved, and I did cry at the end, so it certainly still had me hooked. But it was one of those books where when I took a step back from it, I just felt like the first half was so much stronger, and the second half I felt maybe did border a little bit on like misery porn. I don't know, I was unsure, but yeah, I don't know. It's a hard one because I think she wrote childhood really well, but I've read the blurbs for her other books and they all sound like much of the same, like misery porn of a childhood, and I don't know if I... So yeah, let me know if you've read any other Sofie Laguna novels. I'd be interested in knowing what you think of this one. And this is something I always struggle with. You know, I love reading depressing books. I think books that handle difficult topics are super important, but there's always a concern that they can border on either misery porn or being too saccharine. And I think this novel in the second half did a little bit of both. Not a lot, but a little bit. So I gave this one 3.5 stars as well. And then I recently got myself an e-reader, so I have joined NetGalley, which is perhaps a mistake. I accidentally joined the US version of NetGalley, and then I got confused about the fact that loads of the books wouldn't let me request them, and also just loads of books I knew were being published in the UK weren't on there. So then I realised I could also join the UK version of NetGalley. It's got a little bit out of hand. I have a massive list of books to read, and I've had to like write a little list of the dates when they've got to be read by, so that I can try and actually manage to read and review a lot of them. Very exciting, but a bit overwhelming. So one of the first ones I read via NetGalley was Friends and Dark Shapes by Kavita Bedford. This is a new release, it came out in March I believe. Kavita Bedford is an Indian-Australian author, and this book is set in Sydney. I'm going to read you a bit of the blurb because I feel like it just does way better at describing the book than I can. It says, a group of housemates in Sydney's inner city contend with gentrification, diverse politics, stalled careers, their own complicated privilege as second-generation Australians, and the evolving world of dating in this moving, funny and stylish debut novel. So this, in a lot of the reviews I saw, was described as a very millennial novel, which I completely get. I'd say the protagonist is late 20s, early 30s, like very similar to my own age, and she's living in a house share with people of a similar age to herself, and they're all at a point in their lives where they're starting to feel that they should be moving forward in their careers, or you know, moving forward in like getting their own home and a mortgage and maybe getting into more serious relationships. Quite a few of them are in creative style careers, and there's one of them who isn't but is making more money than the rest of them. There's a bit of like commentary on that, like, you know, the idea of whether that's selling out or what. And they're a really diverse group of friends. They have, like, you know, like it says, a lot of them are second generation Australians, so it's really interesting hearing them around the kitchen table, like discussing their heritage and how they feel. And a lot of this, like the blurb says, is a commentary on gentrification, which I found really interesting. Now, couple of things to mention. One is that this is set in Sydney. I've never been to Australia, and I'll probably never go because I can barely stand over like 21 degrees Celsius, so I don't think I'd survive in Australia. So I think if you live in Sydney or have lived in Sydney, or just, you know Sydney well as a city, you could really get a lot out of this novel. I felt like I really got to know Sydney as a city, and I really enjoyed that, but I'm very aware that I probably didn't appreciate certain descriptions and a commentary on Sydney as much as somebody who knew the city would. Like I said, a lot of the reviews I read were people who knew Sydney well and said it was, you know, excellent. So I probably missed out a little bit there. And another thing is that this is written in a sort of vignette style, and the protagonist is, I believe, a similar age to the author. She's also Indian American, and she is a journalist by trade, and so it feels a little bit like perhaps metafiction. The protagonist is at a similar place, and I felt like a lot of the novel was more an exploration of like themes and ideas than it was a novel, okay? Like, there isn't really a plot arc. I guess if you had to say there was one, the main character has recently lost her father, he's passed away, and she was incredibly close to him, and that was written really beautifully, and she sort of moves through a cycle of grief throughout the novel and comes to a certain place in that grief towards the end. But other than that, it's just sort of vignettes of her time and her friends' time and what they get up to in Sydney. And so I almost felt like this, I thought it was a great novel, but I felt like it could have perhaps been an even greater essay collection, because I felt like Kavita Bedford had a lot to say about Sydney. really interesting things about the neighbourhood and the people, and like I said, gentrification. I would 100% pick up any non-fiction book she released, and I will definitely keep an eye on her, and again, like, I'd pick up any novel she brought out. So I gave this 3.5 stars as well, a lot of 3.5 stars, but I felt like on the one hand this book was beautifully written. I mean, I have a section tabbed. I'm trying to get used to tabbing things on an e-reader. I don't find it anywhere near as easy as tabbing things in a physical book, but this is brilliantly written. It's precise, thoughtful and beautiful all at once, so I do really recommend it, and this is a bit I highlighted because it really resonated with me. I think it will, you know, resonate with pretty much everybody. I think about how once you live in a place long enough, your personal history takes over, and it can be hard to reimagine those first clean moments in a landscape that is not yet tarnished by your personal myths. So yeah, I thought that was really beautiful. So I definitely recommend it if you're somebody who likes a novel that explores all those themes but doesn't necessarily have a strong plot arc to it. And then lastly, I had this novel on pre-order for about a year. This one came out in Australia maybe the beginning of last year, or it could even have been the end of 2019, but it was postponed in the UK because of COVID, so it only came out in the end in January this year, and that is The Yield by Tara June Winch. This is a very beautiful edition. I really love this front cover. I think it was a great choice. So this one's a little bit difficult to explain, this one, because there's 3 narrative threads, so I'm going to do my best. So Tara June Winch has previously written, I think, short story collections and novellas, and this is her first book published in the UK, so this is the first one I've been able to get hold of easily, although I would like to read her other books as well. She's a Aboriginal Australian author, she is Wiradjuri, and this is a really interesting discussion focused on a Wiradjuri family who have sort of something happening to the land they and their ancestors have lived on. So in present day, a young woman called August Gondawindi, who is living in London, gets a phone call to say that her grandfather has passed away, and so she goes back to Australia to visit her grandmother, to spend time with her and prepare for the funeral and to mourn with her family. And you find out quite early on that the reason August left Australia and moved to London was because when she was a young girl, her sister disappeared, was never found, and was assumed sort of abducted and murdered, and she never got over it, and she felt that by moving to the other side of the world she could at least stop searching in all these strangers' faces thinking that any woman could be her sister. So she sort of spent her whole life running and very clearly hasn't really built a very good life for herself. She isn't in a really mentally healthy space when she goes back to her grandmother. And in that narrative she finds out that they are being kicked out of the land because it turns out they were just sort of leasing this land, and I think they're being kicked out. I can't remember if it's for coal or oil, but it's being taken from them basically, and they haven't got long to get out, a couple of weeks. And then the second narrative is from her grandfather's perspective, and it turns out he was writing a dictionary of the Wiradjuri language because he loved the Oxford English Dictionary, but he realised it didn't have a single word in it from his language. And he was somebody who had an ability to see and speak to his ancestors, and so he learnt a lot of the family history, and he realises that that's going to be lost if he doesn't write that down and ensure that it's handed on. So through the dictionary he writes, you get a lot of information, and I think that was really excellently done. You know, I've never read a novel that does that through dictionary definitions of words you find out a lot about the history of a people. A lot of that's obviously incredibly sad, and they have words in their language that they shouldn't need to have, but they do have because of the horrific things that have been done to them by the colonisers from Britain. And then the third and final narrative is from a priest in the early 1900s who started the mission that the present day characters live on. And he started this mission and invited Aboriginal people to live there because he was trying to convert them. And a lot of them would be separated from their children, so the children would lose their language, and it was all very intentional. But he's writing this letter at a time when he's looking back and realising that he deeply regrets his involvement in eradicating a people. You know, he felt like he was saving them because, you know, in some ways he would protect them from violence from incredibly racist white people, but on the other hand, he was eliminating all forms of their culture. And he sort of regrets that. And so through these 3 narratives, you're learning the history of this land and everything it holds. And it's pretty devastating because at the same time as you see that August really wants to hold on to this land and these buildings because their grandparents lived there for a lot of years and did some really wonderful things there, you also see that that land and those group of buildings were originally used for a really horrific event done to their ancestors. So it's it's a bit jarring to see that these people were once forced to live there and now are being forced to leave just to suit the whims of white settlers, basically. So I think this novel is incredibly strong in terms of its themes. I thought the 2 sections from the 2 men, so the grandfather and the priest, were excellent. Really enjoyed both of them. Where this was let down just a little bit for me, again this was around the 3.5-star read, was in August's narrative. I felt that she wasn't a strong character in and of herself. I really loved all the aunts. I loved her grandmother, and I really enjoyed her grandfather, both the way August described him and his own scenes. I didn't like the priest, but I thought the way he wrote his letter, the information we were given was really well executed. But yeah, I felt August was the least developed character, and she was sort of carrying the novel in a way. And I also felt like her section wasn't brilliantly paced. There was a sort of lull in it in the first half, and then towards the end it sort of speeds up a bit and becomes a bit more sort of epic than I expected it to. So I enjoyed this. I definitely read something else from this author. But you know, when a novel is multiple perspective, I think as soon as there's a perspective where you're like, oh, I'm not enjoying this one as much, that's a failing of the author, because you should enjoy them all equally, you know, ideally. So yeah, I definitely enjoyed this and I would 100% recommend it. But again, this is a book that isn't super plot driven. It's much more interested in discussing the themes that it's talking about. So yeah, I definitely recommend this. I definitely want to pick up more by this author. And yeah, those are all the books I read for Aussie April. I'm quite pleased because these 2 were off my TBR shelf, which I've got down to around 45 books. And I've been really rubbish recently at reading books off my TBR shelves. And so as soon as I realised I had 2 books for Aussie April, I was like, I need to read both of them. And I did, so I'm quite proud. So yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books. Feel free to give me recommendations down below based on what I said about these books. And like I said, please feel free to give me recommendations for some less depressing Australian books, because that would be nice. As much as I really loved everything I learned from all these books in terms of their exploration of quite depressing topics, I don't want that to be the only thing I read about a country, because I feel like that's a bit unfair. So yeah, let me know down below if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, and anything else you want to chat about down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!